You know you're supposed to put your garden in full sun, and you've heard that that means at least 6 hours of direct sun during the growing season. But how do you really determine where the best location is for your garden based on the amount of sun? Well, the answer can be sun mapping. Join me today as I show you how to do it. Hi, I'm Gardener Scott, and I'm sitting in my vegetable garden. This was the spot I chose for my garden, partly because I have no obstructions to the south, so I have full sun during most of the day. What I didn't completely realize at the time was how much the shed behind me actually casts shade onto this vegetable garden. And I do get at least 6 hours of sun during the growing season, but that amount of shade dramatically impacts all of the plants that I can grow in my hugelkultur mound and in these beds. It's not a big problem, but if I had done the sun mapping before, I probably would have moved my garden a little more in the direction away from that shed. And this highlights a very important aspect when it comes to choosing the best location for your garden and doing something like sun mapping to make that decision. You really need to see an entire year, at least an entire growing season, so that you can figure out how the sun shines on your garden, where it rises at different seasons, where it sets in different seasons, and very importantly, how structures and trees influence the sun within your garden. You may look at your garden location and think, wow, this is in full sun, but if you don't notice that you've got a tree like this, well, when this leafs out, it'll block everything behind it. Now all of a sudden, that location isn't in full sun. The process of sun mapping actually involves making a map of your garden and then annotating on it where the sun and the shadows are. And I'll show you how I do that in a little bit. I suggest doing it over a 6-month period. From the spring equinox to the autumnal equinox, you can get a really good idea of what the sun is going to do in your garden. And this is one of those things that I also suggest doing on a recurring basis, because as you add beds to your garden and other structures, you'll see that things change. Like with this arch trellis that I made. When I first put these beds in place, there was no shade at all on this area. But by putting up this trellis and then growing plants up it, well, everything behind me is going to be in the shade during much of the growing season. That will influence what plants I select, both on this side in full sun and on that sun that will probably be in full shade. This is all part of the sun mapping to get a really good feel for the sun and the shadows and which plants you should be growing in different areas of your garden. This isn't something that you need to do every day, but maybe set aside one day a week during that entire 6-month period to figure out how the sun is moving across your garden. And so the way I do it to begin is to actually go out first thing in the morning and then every 2 hours take a picture of where the shadows are in my garden. I did that for this area, just to see during this time of year in very early spring how the shadows were affected by this shed. As you may have been able to see, during the early morning, this vegetable garden is in full sun, and it is through the early afternoon. But by mid-afternoon, this area starts being impacted by shade. And surprisingly, by late afternoon, these beds are in full shade. I know that now for early spring, and that will influence some of the plants I put in, because This bed behind me really is only getting 6 hours of sun right now. I may have to delay some of the plants I'll put in it until I get more sun. And that's why you keep updating your map, so that I can figure out at what point do I get enough sun to support the plants in these beds. This is an area where I've got a couple fruit trees and I'm planning on growing a lot of native plants. Those plants are currently seedlings, but I'm going to be putting many of them out in this space as soon as possible. So I went ahead and spent a day taking the pictures to see how the shade is moving across this area. Again, it's quite apparent that this garage begins to cast shade in early to mid-afternoon. And by late afternoon, this whole area is in the shade. That will influence how well my plants do when I put them in the ground in just a few weeks. By continuing the mapping, I'll be able to identify when is the best point for the future to begin the transplants as I build out the rest of this garden area. So I made a photo record of the shadows going across my yard with both the garage and the shed's impact on those shadows. Now to do a map, you can do it a couple different ways. Blank sheet of paper, colored pencils, maybe some fluorescent markers, but the idea is that we're going to actually draw on the paper now what that image looks like from straight down, where our garden beds are, where that structure is, and how the sun plays across our garden. And so I've made a rough map of my yard. Here's the garage, the couple fruit trees, I have my shed, my hugelkultur mound, and the beds I'm most concerned about. And I'm going to approach this from the first week of spring. And at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun casts a shadow about like this. And then at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the sun casts a shadow that's more like this. And then at 6 o'clock, the sun casts a shadow that's more like this. And I can color it in just to get a little better graphic representation of what the sun and shade looks like in my garden space. But this is a real rough estimate as to my yard and how the sun maps with these two major obstacles. Now, in addition to taking the photo record of the shadows across my yard, I did go out with a tape measure and measured the shadow at different points. That's how I was able to get this rough representation of the shadows. You can be very precise. If you use grid paper, not only are the structures exact, but if you measure the shadow, now you can annotate the shadow on your sun map and it will be perfect. This is a representation of what the sun looks like in the very beginning of spring in my garden. I'll do this sun map again, probably once every 2 to 3 weeks, and I can compare those images all the way up to the summer solstice. And at that point, I really don't need to do maps anymore, because for the most part, the sun rises to its peak in the sky on the solstice, and then it starts dropping back down closer to the horizon. And so as it drops down, it's going to correspond to these same maps. So essentially, the map that I'm doing at the very beginning of spring should give me the same shadows that I'll see at the very beginning of fall. Now, if you don't want to take pencil and paper and make an actual map, you can still do sun mapping in your garden. And this is how I've done it over the course of many years with colored flags. Instead of documenting an entire day's cycle weekly, I'll come out periodically during the growing season for an area that I'm concerned about, and I'll mark the shade at like noon. And that's the edge for that particular area at 12 o'clock. And then a week or two later, when I think about it again, I'll come out with another flag. And I'll mark where the edge of the shadow is. This can be quite useful if you've got plants that just aren't performing as well as you think they should. It could be because of the way the shadows are moving across your garden. Having an actual map is important to help me observe more about the sun and the shade. And it also helps as I expand my garden and determine what the plan will be. I haven't figured out where I'm going to put the beds behind me, and there's no plants back there yet because I'm going to build a pergola right here, and I know this structure will cast shade behind me. So I'm waiting until next year to decide what beds are going to go in because I'm planning to build that structure this year and then begin tracking the shade. And the shade behind me will not only influence where the beds go, but what plants go in those beds. Don't think that this is an extra chore and that you really need to make it complicated. Make it as easy as possible on yourself. You're really the only one that's going to see the sun map that you create for your garden. So you can get in with lots of different colored pencils, or you can just mark it with some flags. Whatever works best for you so that you can have more success in your garden because you understand how the sun and the shade works in your garden and how it impacts your plants. To learn more about gardening and different aspects to have that gardening success, well, watch one of these Gardener Scott videos next. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.